Now, for those who don't know me, my name is Penpa Tsering, and I am the democratically elected leader of the Tibetans in exile. Since His Holiness the Dalai Lama devolved his political and administrative responsibilities in 2011, we have been having direct election of the elected leaders since 2001. Since 2001 to 2010, His Holiness has been saying that I'm semi-retired. In 2011, he devolved all his responsibilities, both administrative and political, and I am the third in a sense, starting from 12 to 11, but my predecessor served for 10 years. This is my first term. And this is my second visit to Gangtok as Sikyong, or the democratically elected leader of the Tibetan people. Now, since we assumed office, that was also the time when pandemic was raging, and the world was looking at China in a different way. So even though we follow what is called as the middle way policy proposed by His Holiness the Dalai Lama to seek a non-violent, negotiated, mutually beneficial solution that would be lasting. And we are committed to following this policy that His Holiness has proposed and also approved unanimously by the Tibetan Parliament in exile. We decided to change the strategy a little bit, because when we say middle way, then you also talk about the extremes or the polarities. Without recognition to the polarities, there is no value for the middle way. So in the political sense, one polarity is the present situation of occupied Tibet under the repressive Chinese communist government, and the other polarity is the historical status of Tibet as an independent state. The one polarity, the situation inside Tibet, which I keep saying that we are dying a slow death, and that cultural genocide is happening inside Tibet. We often get asked question as to why people don't get to hear much about Tibet these days. That is because if people have read George Orwell's 1984, it's more like George Orwell's 1984 coming into reality in the whole of China, and more particularly in Tibet, where the state surveils and controls all the population. And right now, under the present dispensation of President Xi Jinping, all the policies of the Chinese government are aimed at eradication of the identity of all the nationalities. Unfortunately, the whole world is moving towards multiculturalism, but China is the only country that's moving towards uniculturalism, where the president is aiming for the whole nation to speak only one language, that's Mandarin Chinese language. And in Tibet, particularly, those of you who are in the know, would vouch also for the report that was done by the special rapporteurs on Tibet that talked about the colonial-style boarding schools in Tibet. Students between the age of 6 to 18, more than 1 million out of 7.3 million Tibetans inside Tibet, are now being forced into boarding schools where they have to study Mandarin language. They have to study Communist Party thought, Xi Jinping thought, and their loyalty to the Communist Party and all that. So in terms of language, Tibetan language, which comes from the Tibetan script, which comes from India in the 7th century, which has nothing to do with Chinese language. And Tibetan language today is considered one among the 15 oldest languages in this world. And we have transliterated every available Sanskrit and Pali Buddhist text from 9th century to 13th century into Tibetan, and Tibetan is the only language where you can really study the essence of Buddhism. And that is being targeted because that is the root of Tibetan identity. And then, of course, the Tibetan Buddhism, when Tibet was independent, you had these big monasteries with thousands of monks and nuns. Now it is reduced to 300, 400 in those big monasteries. The number of monks and nuns have come down drastically. Independent Tibet, monks and nuns could move from one place to another place at their own will. But today, for monks and nuns, you need at least 4 or 5 different permits to travel from one place to another or to preach. That becomes much more difficult. And then the management of the monasteries have been taken over by the United Front Work Department and the multiple intelligence departments, both national and regional level. And now the communist government, who does not believe in any religion, also wants to be responsible for setting up curriculum for Buddhist studies in Tibet. And the last nail on the coffin is the law they passed in 2007 called the Order Number 5, which talks about the atheist government being responsible for recognition of reincarnated lamas, what Chinese call as living Buddhas. So this is aimed at the yet to come 15th Dalai Lama, because they know that if they can control the next reincarnation of this Dalai Lama, they can control the Tibetan people. So they have been preparing for the demise of this Dalai Lama for a very, very long time. And today His Holiness keeps saying, whenever there are long life prayer offerings, that I would live for another 2 decades and more. And there were propitious pre-signs that this Dalai Lama would live very long. And I tell the Chinese, this message is for you, because you are waiting for this Dalai Lama to die, but this Dalai Lama keeps saying, I'll live long. Let's see whether His Holiness the Dalai Lama outlives the Communist Party or the Communist Party outlives the Dalai Lama. Now with this background, not just on Tibetan language or Tibetan religion or culture or Tibetan environment, way of life, everything is being disrupted. That is why I keep saying that we are being squeezed like by a python, and out of our breath. So we are dying a slow death, culturally, linguistically. The Tibetan identity is being destroyed. So with that in mind and the international political scenario in mind, we changed our strategy a little bit by focusing on the polarities, because what is happening inside Tibet, we keep telling the international community, but the historical status of Tibet is not much focused on. So there are 4 reasons why we do this. One is to send a clear message to China that they cannot change history. Chinese leaders, just on their whims and fancies, cannot change history, because history is in the past. When His Holiness was also put this condition that His Holiness should say Tibet was part of China, His Holiness said that I'm a Buddhist monk, I cannot lie. And also the fact that His Holiness also says that I'm not a historian. Let's leave history to historians. That is one message for the Chinese leadership, that they cannot change history. And the second message is for the international community, because the Chinese government asks every government to say Tibet is part of People's Republic of China. And then all these countries, at the behest of the Chinese government, keeps repeating the statement. So these days we tell the international community that if you keep repeating this statement, you're going against international law, because we have only one agreement with the Chinese, with the Communist Party, that is the 17-point agreement. That was also forced upon us on the threat of war. And the invasion of Tibet in 1950 also was by force. So under international law, it should be null and void. What is happening in Ukraine today with Russia's invasion and what happened to Tibet 74 years ago was the same case. It's the same international law. There's only one international law after the Second World War and the formation of United Nations and definition of modern nation state. And that is why we tell the international community, please read Tibetan history. That's why I carry two books with me these days. One is by Michael van Praag. He's an expert on international law. And he looked at Tibetan history from a legal perspective. And he correlated the comparative Tibetan history, not just by studying Tibetan history, but also working with about 100 scholars from Central Asia, and establishes the fact that whether it was Tibet Yuan, which is Mongols, when Mongols ruled China from 1271 to 1368, or the relation between Pamadruba, Rinpoche, and Devasangma dynasties in Tibet for more than 300 years, when China was ruled by the Ming dynasty from 1368 to 1644. And 2 years before that, in 1642, the fifth Dalai Lama took over the political and temporal leadership of Tibet in 1642. 2 years after that, the Mings were overthrown by the Qings in China. Qings are also Manchus, not Chinese. So looking at all these comparative history and also based on international law, he proves that Tibet has never been considered part of China. And then there's a Chinese professor called Professor Lau. He was always intrigued by this question as to why Chinese government is asking, when he was in his university days, as to why Chinese government is asking every government to say Tibet is part of PRC, if what China has been saying, that Tibet has been part of China since ancient times. If Tibet has been part of China since ancient times, then why is Chinese government asking governments to say Tibet is part of PRC today? So then he became a professor. He spent all his life as an academic, and he retired, and then he downloaded all the imperial Chinese historical records from the Communist Party website. And now he has come out with a book in Chinese, which has already been translated into Tibetan. An English version will come out in the next 3 months, where he proves that imperial China has never considered Tibet as part of China. So these two books I carry, and I ask governments to read the books and then make a decision. Without reading Tibetan history, how can you make a decision at the behest of Chinese government? So when they say Tibet is part of PRC, they are trying to give legitimacy to the Chinese government. Then on the other hand, they keep saying, we support negotiations between the representative of His Holiness Dalai Lama and the Chinese government. So I keep telling them, you are contradicting yourself. Because when every country keeps repeating this statement that Tibet is part of PRC, then where is the reason for China to come and talk to us? You are removing the very ground for negotiation. Yeah. Then the third reason we tell them is, why is Chinese government asking every government to say Tibet is part of PRC? Why not East Turkestan? Why not Manchuria? Why not Southern Mongolia? Or Inner Mongolia from China's perspective? That is because the Chinese government knows that they have no legitimacy of their rule in Tibet, and they are trying to seek that legitimacy from the international community. So even now, when I make a statement from here, if there is a response from the Chinese spokesperson in Beijing, they would say, oh, the Tibetan government in exile is not recognized by any country in this world. That is how they try to prove legitimacy. When they don't have, they try to seek that from the international community. So this is also one of the reasons to send a message to the international community about seeking some recognition for the Tibetan historical status. Then the third reason is, of course, for the Tibetans themselves. Now we are only about 130, 140,000 Tibetans in exile. If Tibetans don't study Tibetan history, then who will? Who else will? And the fourth reason is also within the Tibetan community you have, of course, the official position of middle way, and then you have, independent seekers. So we keep saying we can work together. When on the middle way, to gain leverage and value for middle way, if we can focus on the history of Tibet, then independent seekers, those who seek independence for future, will have to prove the independent nature of Tibet in the past. So it doesn't help arguing amongst the Tibetans. What we need to do is convince the Chinese government and convince the international community about our status. So that's how we are trying to work with this Central Tibetan Administration. This is the 16th cabinet of the Central Tibet. And we were not just doing the talk. We have been walking the talk. So we have been working with the U.S. Congress over the last 2 years, and we got this act called the Resolve Tibet Act passed this July, signed by President Joe Biden into a law. Because the United States is the only country that has a law on Tibet, and it talks about four major issues in this new law. One issue is that Chinese government keeps saying that there is no Tibet problem, there is no Tibet issue. This law says that Tibet is yet an unresolved conflict, and it needs to be resolved under international law. And the second point is this law says the Tibetan people have the right to self-determination. And self-determination is defined under international law, not autonomy. So this is very much in line with the UN General Assembly resolution of 1961 on Tibet. And then the third angle, which is the most important from our perspective, is that the US government says that they do not recognize China's narrative that Tibet has been part of China since ancient times. And then the fourth part of this law talks about the territory of Tibet, because China designs only Tibet autonomous region as Tibet, whereas this law says Tibet consists of all the three provinces of Tibet, which is about 2.5 million square kilometers, or a quarter of China's landmass. So this is where we are now. We just concluded, we all witnessed what happened in the US elections, and former President Trump would be coming back next year, January. So there will be, every country has been doing a lot of studies if such things happen. So it's a very fluid and dynamic situation that we are watching internationally, what is happening inside China, and also what's happening inside Tibet. So based on those things, we make our strategies and move forward internationally. And with this law in the United States, now we have to look at the possibilities of working with the US Congress or the State Department, whether they would be able to, or they will be willing to share some shoulder or responsibilities with us to reach out to other countries to adopt similar positions. And that's where we are. Thank you for coming. I understand that it's a very vibrant fourth estate here. Thank you. Any questions? I will be happy to respond.
So with each passing day, China becomes more powerful, and with its president programmed to be the president of China, President Xi to be the president of China for life. So how hopeful are you with your struggle for freedom? Is that your struggle will bear fruits in coming days?
Now, of course, nobody can say I'm an expert on China, because it's a very opaque system. So anybody who comes out with any kind of analysis will have to base on what is visible on the surface and what could be there inside. Now, there is a realization in the international community that particularly in Europe, if we look at Europe, the 27 countries plus countries surrounding that, they know that Russia is the immediate threat, but the long-term challenge is China. And this realization is also very much there with the US government. And last year I traveled to Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico also. The understanding on China's motivation and China's structure and strength is not very much there. They don't have that awareness of what China is doing around the world and what's happening inside China. From the outside, China might look like a monolith, a very strong power. But I keep saying there are a lot of chinks in the armor. If you look at the general structure itself as to how Xi Jinping is conducting himself, of course they are very much afraid of internal coup. That is why in China, like in India, you have the minister, then you have minister of state, right? So in some countries it's deputy minister, it's vice minister, whatever. So above that rank, you are talking about 1,000-strong leadership in China, but not more than 3 leaders can meet together without the permission of the president. Now, I asked this to another China expert in US who's working in an institute, and he told me it's not just that. Aside from Xi Jinping, you have the other 6 members of the Politburo Standing Committee. They don't have dinner with each other. None of them. That shows how much afraid they are. If they meet together and something goes wrong tomorrow, then they could be blamed for conspiracy. So this is how the system is structured, which also shows how much the leadership is afraid of internal coup. So they make sure that there's no internal coup by not letting leaders meet with each other, making sure that no forces come together to dislodge the present dispensation. That's one thing. Now, I often get asked questions as to whether we think China will attack Taiwan now. I keep saying China is not ready yet. Not ready yet. Because Xi Jinping keeps moving the generals from one theater to another in a very short period of time. So there's no time for the generals to build a better relations with the cadres. And then the first in command, the general, and the second in command, they don't know each other most of the time. So they don't trust each other. They are all watching each other. There's a lot of fear and distrust, even at the top level. Then under the Communist Party system, you also have the parallel political commissars who oversees the military. So to fight a war, you need synchrony amongst all these bodies, including the different theaters and then the rocket forces. Because rocket forces is the pet project of Xi Jinping, which he created, that looks after space technology and missile technology, nuclear technology. And last year they removed 9 people, and most of them from the rocket forces, whom Xi Jinping himself appointed. Now he had to remove them, based on accusation of corruption and all that. But that also points to Xi Jinping's judgment, that he is not able to select the right person, or he was not able to select the right person. So all these are pointers to the fact that it's good for Xi Jinping to make sure that there is no military coup, but not enough to fight a war. Because if you fight a war against, if you try to, get to Taiwan, then you're going up against many other forces. It's not just going to be Taiwan. It's going to go against China. And then the third factor is that China is the only country that spends more money on internal security than external security. That itself manifests a deep distrust between the rulers and the ruled. So these are just overall, structural problems we are talking about, where I feel Xi Jinping is having a lot of sleepless nights. But besides all that, then you also have the problems that China is going through right now with the fall of the property market, where you're talking about the property market consisting about 25 to 30% of the nation's GDP, which is huge. And Chinese government over the last 1.5 years, 2 years have been trying different methods to bring the market back to increase domestic consumption, because that's the only way you can make people buy houses. But people don't have the confidence to spend right now. 2 years of strict COVID restrictions, no income. Whatever savings they have, now they know that government can take a U-turn, just like the COVID decision. So they want to be safe. Whatever savings they have, they want to save it, not spend it. So the domestic consumption is not increasing. So you have a lot of overcapacity, not just in electric vehicles, but also in a lot of consumer durables and all that. So that problem is also there. Then rural governments going bankrupt, because rural governments used to make money by selling land. Now when the property market is down, there's no land value also. So the revenue for the local government goes down, the central government is not helping. And then, of course, with Xi Jinping's policy of going back to socialism, does not encourage private enterprise to become so powerful. So you see the cases of Tencent and Alibaba and all those. A lot of capital flight happening. And for the first time in the last 30, 40 years, China has been developing. It has been boom, boom, boom all the time. At one stage, it even went up to 12, 13%. But today it's down to 5.2%. So this investment, FDI inflows into China, when at its peak in 2012, 13, 14, went up to 300 billion annually. Today it is down to 30 billion, just 10% of what it was. China also needs a lot of investment. Now there is the blockade from the United States on high-end microchips and all those things happening, semiconductors. So particularly in Sikkim, Arunachal Pradesh, Ladakh, all in the Himalayan region, we have very close proximity, which is one of the most non-porous border in the world. Right. So with this, also now we reach out to governments, explain about all these things. Of course, we know that if there has to be a resolution through the middle way, then there's no other way than by talking with the Chinese leadership. So till such a time, till such an opportune time, we'll have to reach out to the international community. We know that when we reach out to the international community, whichever country, will not leave aside their national interests for the sake of Tibetan national interests. That we know. That is why our expectations are also very realistic. We tell governments, since we follow non-violence, because we have to provide an alternative to violence. Since we follow non-violence, we tell governments that the only way, of course, the governments, NATO supporting Ukraine with all these weapons and equipments is very good. Ukrainians are also very brave to be defending the country, and they need to succeed. Otherwise, it will set a lot of bad precedents around the world, including China's with Taiwan. So what we tell them is give China less business. Because right now, 1.5 years back, China was talking about $3.6 trillion reserves worth of foreign exchange reserves, which they splurge it on Belt and Road Initiative, which they splurge it on space technology, on military technology, dual-use technology that West accused China of supplying Russia with, all that. And then with the Belt and Road Initiative creating all these dead economies. That is because China has all these reserves. If China doesn't have all these reserves, then how can they spend on Belt and Road Initiative? They can't. Then they will have to listen to the free world. The more business you give to China, indirectly, Europeans are also indirectly sustaining the war in Ukraine. Because you give business to China, China supplies Russia with the dual-use technologies or whatever else that we don't know, and that helps sustain the war in Ukraine. So give less business, at least have balanced trade. 27 European countries, according to 2021 statistics, they imported 600 billion euros worth of Chinese goods and services, and exported only 200 billion. So EU has a deficit of 400 billion every year. And even as we speak, even with the United States, there's more than 300 billion trade deficit. With India also, despite all the rhetoric, business with China is going up. And this is the time when China needs business. China's pivot is towards the global south. We know they're looking at Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, SCO nations, for market. But what purchasing power they have? They don't have that. If China supplies all their overcapacity to all these global south countries, it's going to kill all their small-scale industries and mid-scale industries. So this needs to be made known, because Chinese investment never comes for free. They will invest, then they will force that country to vote for China at the multilateral forums, including the United Nations. That's how China operates. So we remain hopeful. China may be strong from outside. Even now, there are a lot of rumors going on. Of course, we don't trust all the rumors, but definitely there are a lot of things happening. Even finding no replacement for Qin Gang, who's missing, the former foreign minister. Wang Yi is still functioning as the foreign minister. And the former defense minister Li Shangfu is missing. Now, even academicians are not able to express themselves. They cannot use terms like deflation or depression. Then how can economists analyze Chinese economy? Then you have all this state security law, data security law, anti-espionage law that has penetrated down to the grassroots. It's more like SS happening inside Tibet, where everybody's watching over each other. People live in fear.
So just few months ago, India elected Prime Minister Modi for his third term, and as you mentioned, you has just elected former President Trump for his second term. So how hopeful are you for the support of Prime Minister Modi and President Trump in your struggles?
Now, as I said before also, no country will leave aside their national interests for the interests of Tibet. So with Indian government also, if the Indian leaders feel that the Tibetan interests and the Indian interests are aligning, then there should be some traction or forward movement. But India has a lot of things with China on the table. So we think it's a good time for recalibration of India's policy on Tibet. But I'm nobody to advise the Indian government. Indian government has a lot of brainy people who know what is best. Not only for India, but now if you look at all the neighboring countries around India, I think India has to work much more harder to get the neighbors along, at least. First thing, because China is there everywhere from Sihanouk Wheel to Coco Island to Hambantota to now to Maldives and now Gwadar port, everywhere. I think India has to really work doubly hard, but we make our efforts and we are very, very thankful to the government of India, both central and states, wherever Tibetans are located, for all the humanitarian support. But politically, since the early days when the issue of Tibet was taken to the United Nations, we would have expected or we would have liked to India to play a more positive role. So even now, the opportunity is still there, but it depends on the Indian leadership as to how they want to place themselves in the new geopolitical scenario.
Sir, the people of Sikkim and even the government so far in the Sikkim, all this support the Tibetan cause and all Tibetan community. So what do you have to say on this, or your comment on this support extending by the real people?
Now, Sikkim, Ladakh, Arunachal, Lahore Spiti, all these areas have very close cultural relationship with Tibet, even though we belong to different countries. Because of that, there would be a natural sympathy for the cause of Tibet. But unless you know what is happening exactly inside Tibet and how geopolitics is also evolving and how it's impacting Tibet, then it's impossible for even Sikkimis to support Tibet cause. Yeah, so if you think that Tibet issue is totally different, doesn't matter to us, then I would say you're wrong. It does matter to you, because Tibet is on your northern border, which is occupied by China right now. And they are being belligerent. They are proving they're not just in the South China Sea, they are renaming all the places, not just in Arunachal Pradesh, in the whole of South China Sea, in East China Sea, everywhere. So there was a time when I was in the United States and I was talking to a senior friend, and I told them that was the time when China declared its air defense identification zone. So I said, if US is not careful, today if China can claim the air, they will claim everything underneath that air. And this is exactly what has happened. They are claiming the whole of South China Sea with the 9-dash line. Now they call it 10-dash line, whatever. And with India also on Ladakh. Just day before yesterday, I read one report where you know about the fact that Chinese government has established a lot of xiaogangs or border villages on the Tibetan side, because the idea is to protect the nation, you have to protect the frontiers. Now there were reports that some Tibetans, or a lot of Tibetans, are being moved to one xiaogang area north of Bhutan. That is what it says. But if you look at the Bhutanese map, then it falls within Bhutan's territory. So even with small countries like Bhutan, Nepal, with India, they are still keeping their expansionist, imperial, colonial mindset. They keep telling the world, we are peaceful, we are not doing anything, but they are doing all the aggression. It's because of their actions that all the defense expenditures in the whole neighborhood is expanding. I think the Chinese government does not realize that they are making the West more powerful in defense production. You have Japan, spending about 11-12% of the GDP on defense. Taiwan has to spend more. For the first time, security is becoming an issue in New Zealand. Australia is spending about $356 billion to buy 7 nuclear submarines. All these countries, look at Philippines, what's happening there. Even Malaysia, close to China, but they will have to be careful about their defense. Brunei, Vietnam, now with India, everybody is having problem with China. Then who's at fault? And then all these countries have to buy weapons from the West, most of it. Particularly India, because India was very, very dependent on Russia for its hardware, military supplies. Now today, if India or if China fights a war with India, India is at a lot of disadvantage. If you don't get spare parts from Russia, what happens? Even with huge machineries, it doesn't help. So it's important for Sikkimis also to understand what is happening around the world and how it might impact. It's not just enough that if something is happening there, you just forget about it. Tomorrow, if freedom knocks on your door, then what will happen? And you're not very, very far away, just next door.